A bitter freezing rain falls continuously over the snow-filled drainage ditches bordering a narrow country road near the Ardennes in December 1944. 26-year-old Sergeant Daniel Dan Sullivan kneels in 2 feet of slush, his heavy wool overcoat soaked through to the skin, his raw, blood-stained hands cupping the cold face of his younger brother, Private First Class Michael Sullivan. Tucked into Dan's breast pocket is a silver pocket watch given to them by their father before they shipped overseas, its cover engraved with the words Sullivan Brothers 1939. Michael had been struck by shrapnel during a mortar barrage 20 minutes earlier, dying in his brother's arms as their infantry unit conducted a tactical retreat under fire behind them. Heavy transport trucks are idling along the muddy shoulder, their engines roaring as retreat orders echo down the column. When a stressed retreat lieutenant runs over to the ditch and barks at Dan to leave the body behind and climb aboard the last truck before German armor cuts off the road, Dan does not let go of his brother's coat. He stands up slowly, stepping between the lieutenant and Michael's body. "I'm not leaving my brother in a ditch, sir," Dan says, his voice raspy with grief and unyielding resolve. "He goes home with me, or I stay right here." The lieutenant draws his sidearm, preparing to force the sergeant onto the truck to enforce retreat compliance. He does not notice the heavy command car that has just skidded to a halt in the slush behind him. He completely ignores General George S. Patton standing 3 paces behind him in the freezing rain, nearby soldiers clinging to the sides of the transport trucks freeze in place, watching nervously between the grieving sergeant and the commanding general's rigid figure. Patton stands silently in the downpour while mortar smoke drifts low over the surrounding woods. What happened in the next 30 seconds would reveal a profound truth about love, duty, and leadership in the midst of disaster. And the answer was not what anyone in that rainy ditch was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring these forgotten moments of courage and quiet leadership directly to you every single week. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it cost Sergeant Dan Sullivan to refuse a direct order to abandon his brother's body, you need to understand what a tactical retreat actually meant in the Ardennes in December 1944. The German counteroffensive had caught American forces by surprise, breaking through defense lines and forcing rapid tactical withdrawals. Units were under strict orders to fall back immediately to prevent surrounding maneuvers by enemy armor. During a combat retreat, priority space on transport vehicles was strictly reserved for living personnel, weapons, and essential ammunition. Military protocol mandated that fallen soldiers be left where they lay to be retrieved later by Graves registration units once the line stabilized. Abandoning fallen comrades in a retreat was a devastating emotional burden, but Army doctrine was clear. Living combat power had to be preserved above all else. An enlistee who refused to board a retreat transport faced court-martial for desertion under fire. Every soldier watching from the idling trucks made the exact same mental calculation. They knew the absolute necessity of maintaining retreat speed. They knew Patton's legendary insistence on rapid movement and obedience to orders. They expected Patton to order the sergeant boarded by force so the convoy could depart. But the moral stakes along that muddy road went far beyond military manuals. A family's sacrifice in wartime is a sacred arithmetic equation written in shared blood, grief, and solemn promises. The human math was tragic and absolute. 2 brothers from the same household had marched off to war under a father's tearful plea that they look out for one another. To leave a fallen brother's body in an enemy-controlled ditch to be buried in an unmarked grave broke a sacred bond that transcended army rank, subtract human loyalty from a soldier's heart, and the moral foundation of why men fight collapses entirely. Every minute spent waiting in a dangerous zone carried a measurable risk of mortar fire, yet leaving a brother behind carried a lifelong cost in dishonor. The moral balance could not be compromised. And that was the freezing ditch Dan Sullivan stood his ground in. Picture the scene along that Ardennes country road in December 1944. A dozen trucks packed with exhausted, frostbitten soldiers sit idling in a grey torrent of freezing rain and mud. The air smells of wet wool, diesel exhaust, burnt cordite and cold mud. The sky is dark with low-hanging clouds as distant artillery fire rumbles like thunder along the ridge. Through the rain, Sergeant Dan Sullivan stands blocking the path to his brother's body, his knuckles white around his rifle, his eyes fixed on the lieutenant. Standing beside the command car, Corporal James Miller, a 23-year-old aide from Boston, froze solid. He was not looking at the retreat trucks. He was staring at General George S. Patton, whose tall figure stepped out of the vehicle into the mud. Every man along the convoy performed the exact same calculation. They saw a sergeant refusing a direct retreat order. They saw an army commander known for his stern, uncompromising warrior discipline. Everyone braced for an explosion of command fury. Stay with me, because what happened next in that ditch is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from that retreat column in the Ardennes are remarkably consistent in shape. They come from the soldiers in the trucks and the aides who witnessed the encounter. They all remembered the exact weight of the silence before anyone moved. General Patton did not roar. Not the way a commanding officer reacts to an act of insubordination during a retreat. Not the way a general looks at a soldier delaying a transport column. He looked at Dan Sullivan's tear-streaked, mud-stained face and the silver pocket watch protruding from his pocket the way a father looks at a son suffering unbearable grief. Without saying a single word, Patton took off his heavy steel helmet, holding it against his chest in the freezing rain. He walked over to the edge of the ditch, stepped down into the slush beside Dan, and stood silently beside the fallen private. He turned to his staff car driver and issued a quiet command: "Call up a Graves registration jeep immediately." Patton said, his voice deep and solemn. "We wait right here until he is loaded." Patton stood guard in the rain beside Dan Sullivan for 20 long minutes, unmoving in the mud, until an army mortuary jeep arrived to carry Michael's body to the rear. Only then did Patton place his hand on Dan's shoulder, guide him into the command car, and order the convoy forward. Inside the truck column, soldiers watched in awe as the three-star general rode alongside the grieving sergeant. Miller later recalled that the general's quiet respect in that ditch spoke louder than any speech he ever gave. See, what most folks don't realize is that George S. Patton, despite his fierce public persona, held a deep, sacred respect for the bonds of family and the quiet dignity of fallen soldiers. He recognized that Dan's refusal to leave his brother was not cowardice or rebellion. It was an act of profound love and honor that defined the finest qualities of an American soldier. The math in Patton's mind was immediate and clear. Forcing a soldier to abandon his brother's body would have destroyed the man's soul and broken the spirit of everyone who witnessed it. To Patton, military discipline existed to protect the honor of the nation, not to crush the deepest human loyalties. By standing guard in the rain, Patton was not delaying a retreat out of weakness. He was demonstrating that the life and dignity of every single soldier mattered to the highest command. He transformed himself in that brief fragment of a minute from a terrifying army commander into a compassionate leader who shared the grief of his men. Sergeant Daniel Dan Sullivan was 26 years old, born and raised in South Boston, Massachusetts. His father was a longshoreman who had raised his two sons to stand together through every hardship of life. Before entering the army, Dan worked alongside his brother Michael on the Boston docks, sharing everything from meals to work shifts. In his pocket, Dan carried their father's silver pocket watch engraved with Sullivan Bros. 1939, the symbol of their unbreakable family bond. He was engaged to a girl named Mary who worked at a local Boston bakery, and her letters were filled with prayers for the safe return of both brothers. Dan had a clear plan: return to Boston, care for his aging parents, and honor his brother's memory by living a good, honorable life. He was not a hero of romance. He was a devoted brother who believed that loyalty to family was a duty that never ended. Dan Sullivan survived the war and returned to Boston in 1945, bringing his brother's body home for a proper burial in the family plot. He worked for 30 years as a harbor master, raising a family of his own and keeping the silver pocket watch on his nightstand until the day he died. Looking back at that icy ditch in the Ardennes in December 1944, a compelling question of leadership arises. Was General Patton right to halt a retreat column to guard a fallen soldier's body, or should commanders enforce retreat schedules strictly to protect living troops? One view holds that operational speed must take precedence over personal grief to ensure convoy safety. The other view holds that honoring human devotion and family bonds reinforces the moral strength of an entire army. What do you think? Was Patton's choice an act of noble leadership or a risky operational delay? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold World War II stories every week.